English 101, let's talk about your narrative paper. I've titled this presentation, Tell Me a Story, because that's exactly what we're going to do with this assignment. So here's what you need to know. There we go. First of all, narrative tells a story. Most of you have probably written a story at some point in your educational career. And that skill is one that will benefit you for the rest of your life. The ability to share, to communicate experiences, and what you've learned from those experiences is a lifelong skill. So, specifically about narrative, though, it can be a way to write a paper in and of itself, its own pattern of development. But you can also use narrative inside of other types of papers. So maybe in a compare-contrast paper, you can tell me a story about your childhood versus your little brother's childhood, and those two stories together create your compare-contrast paper. So narrative can be on its own, but it can also be a smaller section of a different kind of paper as well. So that's part of the reason why we start with narrative. And while a lot of times when we think about narrative, we think about the story itself. So we think about going fishing or about the time a sibling was born, right? So we think about the event itself as narrative writing, but really the idea and the successfulness of narrative writing is about communicating emotions. So it's really more about the joy or the love or the loss, because I wasn't there in your story. I haven't had a similar experience. But the reason that humans connect so much over narrative is because we have felt those same feelings, right? We have also shared in the feeling of joy or the feeling of love or the feeling of loss. And that is what makes us appreciate good story. So it's really about communicating feeling and emotion to other people and us connecting over those emotions. I love this quote by Willa Cather. She said, "There are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before." You know, a lot of my students say, "I have nothing new to say. Like, I don't know any interesting way to tell this story." Well, what makes it interesting is that it's your story. That's the interesting part. If you go to a scary movie, you know what's going to happen. You already know. But we keep going and watching scary movies. It's the same with romantic comedies. We all know how it's going to end, but we still go watch them anyway. So what makes them different, though, is our experience of that emotion, of that event in our lives. And that's where the power of narrative lies. So here's what you need to know. Here's really what you're doing with narrative writing. It's a compressed moment that has a meaning. Sometimes I like to describe this as a short moment with a long meaning. Okay, here's what I mean by that. I don't want you to tell me about your entire trip to Florida. That is boring. We do not want to listen to that at all. What we do want to hear about is the moment that you almost drowned. Now that's interesting to us. Okay, we want to hear about that. And the reason we want to hear about it is because we've also felt fear. So we get that feeling. Okay, so that's what you want to share. You want a very short moment. Okay, I don't want to hear about your entire trip. That's boring. Don't tell us that. So we're talking seconds, we're talking minutes here that you're going to cover in this paper. We are not talking days, we're not talking weeks, nothing like that. Maybe if you want to tell us about falling in love, well, you wouldn't tell us about your entire relationship. We don't care. But what we do want to hear about is that moment that you decided, I'm in love with this person. That feeling and that intense emotion, that is what is interesting to us. So hopefully that makes sense. That's what I mean when I say it's a very short moment with a lot of meaning in it. Okay, so when you're thinking about topics, you want to think about something that fits that definition. All right. Okay. So when you're planning to write, a couple things you need to consider. Of course, you need to figure out who your audience is. For this paper, your audience is going to be your peers. So you're writing to them. All right. So decide what would appeal to your audience and write appropriately to them. Your purpose for this paper is to entertain. So there are 3 purposes for writing, right? To inform, to persuade, and to entertain. So this paper is to entertain. But let me be clear. To entertain does not mean it is funny. Funny is one way to entertain, but sadness is just as entertaining. What we mean by to entertain is just that it holds our interest, okay, and that we enjoy the journey with you. So it can be happy, it could be sad. All of those things are still under the umbrella of entertaining, okay? The point of view for this paper, there are quite a few options. Typically, we write narrative in first person, so you are allowed to use I for this paper. I'm perfectly okay with that. But do you have to write from your own point of view? No. Some of my very favorite papers have been from the point of view of inanimate objects. I had a girl write about her red high heels, a pencil, from the perspective of your dog. All of those things are interesting, they're intriguing, people like to listen to them, so they help with that purpose of being entertaining. All right, so consider what point of view you might use for this paper. All right, so one of the ways to come up with topics is to brainstorm very powerful memories. That's what most narrative is that we share specific memories. Okay, so when you're choosing a memory, if that's the way you go, you want to consider a couple things. Number one, is it significant? So does it have big meaning that you can share with us? Number two, do you remember it? Because if you're struggling to remember the details, you'll struggle to write the paper. All right, so be careful with that. And then are you willing to share it? If it's something deeply personal that brings out big emotion in you, is that something that you're okay, that you're comfortable sharing with your group? So consider that when you're thinking about topics. But the big thing is you want to choose some kind of short moment that has big emotion with it. All right. So once you have a topic, you have to think about your thesis, right? We got to have a thesis. The thesis for this paper needs to have two parts to it. So number one, what is your moment, right? We need that. But you also need the so what of your paper. Why are you telling us this story? And remember, it's not about the event, it's about the feeling. Okay, so the so what of this paper is what feeling are we both supposed to share, okay, between you and the reader. So the question to ask yourself is, what did I learn? Why is this memory important to me? What is the big feeling or the larger meaning of my life? And the fact that it meant something very important to you in your life is enough of a so what. Okay, it doesn't have to be like some big thing, that exemplifies the human experience. That it was important to you for a particular reason is enough of a so what. All right, so your thesis has two parts. What is the event? What did you learn from it? Or what is the emotion you're trying to convey? Okay, so I've given you an example here that gives you the emotion that I would include. So my event is riding a roller coaster, but my feeling is facing my fear. So my feeling is fear, and what I learned was that I can face those fears and that I can have rewarding experiences from that. So there's an example. Once you have a topic and you've considered a thesis, and by the way, that thesis can change as you start writing the paper, that's perfectly fine. So don't feel like once you write a thesis, you're stuck with it. That's not the case. You'll have to then decide, when you've decided on your event that you're going to focus on, what section of the story you're going to tell us. Because remember, we don't want the whole story, we want the most important part of it. Okay, so once you've decided on that section, then this is where you really need to dig into the details. We just did descriptive writing. Okay, so we're going to take all of that you learned from descriptive writing about using your sensory details, and we're going to bring it to narrative, because good narrative has great sensory details. All right, so when you're thinking about this, you need to be able to pull details from these sections and answer the W questions, right? Who, what happened, when, where, and so what. So this is a great way to brainstorm before, or to plan before you write your paper, is can I answer these questions with some details? So that's a great way to plan before writing. Also, you want to make sure that you don't give us every detail. That can be very boring. You only want to give us the details that actually move the story along and help convey your feeling. So if I'm trying to convey the feeling of riding a roller coaster, facing my fears, and how afraid I was, I don't necessarily have to tell you that the sky was blue, because does that matter? Not really. Right? It doesn't move my story along really, and it doesn't help convey my feeling. So be very, very careful that you just don't over detail your paper. Sometimes we want to just throw in every single detail. What that really leads to is just a really disorganized paper that has a lack of focus. Sorry. So make sure that you're careful about the details that you choose. All right. One thing I like to include is I had a great Aunt Lethe who would spend half an hour telling me about her trip to the grocery store because she would tell me about all these details that I didn't care about. So don't be my great Aunt Lethe. Pick the most important parts. Keep the story moving. All right. That's important. Also, to help us feel like we're there, some of your details should be given to us in dialogue. All right. So what did the people who were in your story, your characters, what did they actually say? Now, keep in mind a couple of things about dialogue. Number one, it doesn't have to be grammatically correct. We don't always speak grammatically correct, and dialogue needs to sound like people speak. So it may not be complete sentences. It may not, be grammatically correct. There may be a lot of contractions and things like that. Totally fine. It needs to sound real. It needs to sound like real people, not perfect grammatically correct English. People don't speak like that. All right. So add some dialogue also into this particular story. Remember that every time you change speakers, you need to make a new paragraph. So that's something different about adding in dialogue. So if I say something, it's a paragraph, right? But then when my husband responds, he gets a new paragraph. When my daughter Elsie then jumps in there and adds to the conversation, she gets her own paragraph. If my husband Daniel then responds back to her because we've now changed speakers, he gets a new paragraph again. Which is why sometimes in books you'll see a page that just has, one sentence dialogue, and it's because the characters are going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So every time the speaker changes, it's a new paragraph. All right, so keep that in mind. Make sure you also include tags in there so that we know who is speaking. So, I love you, commented Elsie. Avoid said, that's kind of a boring word. But add some dialogue that should be included in the details of your story. All right, how are you going to organize a narrative paper? How do you take all those details now that you came up with and put down? How do we organize it? Well, typically we write narrative in chronological order, so we base it on time, right? But there is a way you can change that up a little bit. You can use flashback. And so the idea with flashback is you actually start in the present and then you go back to the past. And then in your conclusion, you come back to the present where you started in the introduction. So there's an example of that in the textbook. And it can be very powerful, but you have to be very careful to make sure that it's very clear to your reader that that's what you're doing. All right. Okay, so you have an idea, you have a topic, you come up with a potential thesis, you list out all your details, now you're ready to write your paper. Again, lots of paragraphs in narrative. Okay, so you don't have to follow that 8 to 10 sentences, 5 to 8 sentences for a paragraph, because narrative works differently. So every time there's a new action or somebody does something new, that should be a new paragraph. Also, every time, again, that you change speakers, new paragraphs. So you may have lots of paragraphs in narrative, and that's perfectly fine. Make sure that you use time signals. So we need transitional words that indicate time. So after, next, you can use the movement of the sun, as the sun was going down, things like that to signal to us the movement of time through your story. So make sure that you give us those time signals. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that you have to keep your point of view and your verb tenses the same. So if you start out in first person, you need to stay in first person. So if you start out with I, make sure you stay using I the entire time. Also, if you start out writing your paper in past tense, make sure you stay in past tense. What tends to happen is people get into the story and suddenly they switch from past tense to present tense because they're there in the moment again. And so suddenly the writer moves into present tense. Don't do that. If you're going to write it in past tense, which most people do because it's something that happened in the past, make sure you stay in past tense the whole way. Also, no commentary. We don't need ums or LOLs or anything like that in your paper. This is still academic writing, so make sure you hold those conventions. You have to have sensory details to have good narrative. So still tell us, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you smell? All of those things make good narrative. So you need to be very descriptive if you're going to do this well. And don't forget to include dialogue when you're writing your draft. Okay, a couple of things to think about. You can try out circle endings. So what that means is you start with something in the introduction and you come back to that same idea in the conclusion. It just helps your story feel really cohesive and unified, and it's a good feeling for your readers. Be very careful when you're writing narrative to avoid repeating similar words and phrases. That seems to be a common issue with narrative writing. So make sure that you're using unique terms as you're telling your story. Be very careful with comma rules. Two big ones that I see a lot in narrative writing, when you give us, students tend to write narrative. When they write narrative, their sentences get really long because you're in the moment and you want to tell us all about it. So be careful with your sentences that they don't get too long. If you have introductory phrases, so after I walked in the house, comma, I said hello to my mom. All right, so make sure if you have a little introductory thought that maybe tells us when or where or something like that, it gets a comma and then the rest of the sentence. All right, so be careful with those complex sentences. Also, if you have two sentences you're putting together with an and or a but or an or, make sure there's a comma between them because those two sentences, are different ideas. So feel free to use semicolons. Don't use them too much, but feel free to use some semicolons. Also, make sure your pronouns agree. When we're talking about people, if you're talking about one person, you need to use his, her, he, she. If you're talking about a group of people, you can use their. Make sure you don't mix them up, okay? Don't mix them. Don't talk about a group and use he or she, and then don't talk about one person and use their. So be careful with your pronouns when you're talking about people. Also, I see a lot of incomplete sentences in narrative. That's fine in your dialogue, but outside of the dialogue, be very careful with sentences that start with ing. So being in the car with my friends. That's not a complete sentence, all right? And the big thing to be aware of is this ing verb right there. That's usually what gets students in trouble. So be careful with that one, all right? Some other things, some grammar rules to keep in mind. Be careful with those comma splices and those run-ons. And then we'll talk about some of these other things as well as we go through the class. All right. Have a great day. Happy writing. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. All right. Have a good one. Bye.